Eleanor Whitfield had learned, long before she understood the word for it, that she was the one nobody noticed first. In a house with 3 daughters, she was the third thought, the quiet shadow standing slightly behind her sisters in every family portrait ever commissioned. Her sisters, Margaret and Constance, were the bright coins of the family, polished and displayed at every gathering, while Eleanor was kept folded away like a letter nobody had gotten around to reading. Their father, Sir Walter Whitfield, was a baronet of modest means and considerable ambition. He had decided early in his daughters' lives that the family's fortunes would be restored through marriage rather than industry, and he spoke of his 2 eldest daughters the way a merchant might speak of fine goods ready for market. Margaret, the eldest, had a laugh that filled entire rooms and a gift for making any man feel clever simply by listening to him talk about himself. Constance, the second daughter, had golden hair and a natural sense of style that made her the envy of every assembly she attended. Eleanor had neither gift. She had a soft voice, a habit of reading until her candle burned down to nothing, and a quiet way of noticing small things that everyone else seemed to miss entirely. When the invitation arrived for the autumn gathering at Ashbourne Hall, the grand seat of the Duke of Calloway, the Whitfield household dissolved into the kind of busy chaos that only 3 unmarried daughters and 1 anxious mother could create. Lady Whitfield spent a full week deciding which of Margaret's gowns caught the candlelight most flatteringly, and which of Constance's bonnets best framed her pretty face. Eleanor was fitted for a new gown only because manners demanded she have one for such an occasion, not because anyone truly expected her presence to matter to the evening's outcome. "You needn't trouble yourself too much with conversation, dear," her mother told her one morning, while adjusting the sleeve of Margaret's gown in the looking-glass and speaking to Eleanor's reflection rather than to Eleanor herself. "Simply smile and stay near your sisters. The Duke will hardly notice a third daughter when there are 2 such lovely young women already in the room." Eleanor said nothing in reply. She had stopped expecting to be noticed many years before, and there was a strange, settled peace in that quiet acceptance. She no longer braced herself for disappointment, because she no longer allowed herself to hope for anything different. On the evening of the gathering, Ashbourne Hall rose before their carriage, like something from a half-remembered dream, larger and grander than any house Eleanor had ever entered. Its long halls were lined with portraits of stern ancestors, and its ballroom blazed with the light of 100 candles, reflected endlessly in tall mirrors along the walls. Margaret moved through the crowded room like a ship under full sail, drawing admiring glances and easy laughter wherever she passed. Constance followed close behind, her golden hair catching the candlelight in a way that seemed entirely too perfect to be accidental, and likely was not. Eleanor found a quiet corner near a row of tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens, content to watch the evening unfold rather than take part in it directly. It was from this corner that she first saw him. He was not announced with any particular fanfare, yet the room itself seemed to shift slightly at his entrance, conversations dipping low and then rising again, like a tide answering the pull of the moon. The Duke of Calloway was younger than Eleanor had expected, with an unhurried, watchful way of moving through his own ballroom that suggested he was far more comfortable observing a room than performing for it. He greeted his guests with polite warmth, yet Eleanor noticed something else in his manner, a careful attentiveness in his eyes, as though he were quietly studying the gathering rather than simply enjoying it. Margaret secured an introduction to him within the first half-hour of the evening, and Eleanor watched from her corner as her sister deployed every ounce of charm she possessed. The Duke smiled and nodded politely, answering Margaret's bright questions with practiced courtesy, yet his gaze drifted more than once toward the quieter edges of the room, rather than remaining fixed on her sister's animated face. Constance fared little better, despite securing a dance that drew admiring glances from half the assembled guests. She was graceful and lovely in the candlelight, certainly, but the brief conversation that followed her dance with the Duke was formal and polite, the kind of exchange a man offers out of simple obligation rather than genuine interest. Eleanor remained tucked in her corner, half hidden behind a tall potted fern, content to watch the evening pass without involving herself in it. She might have stayed there the entire night, unnoticed and unbothered, had it not been for the small spaniel that came skittering frantically across the polished ballroom floor, its leash tangled hopelessly around its own legs, clearly terrified by the noise and the press of unfamiliar people. It was, she would later learn, the Duke's own dog, having slipped free of its lead during the confusion of greeting so many arriving guests. No one else in the crowded room seemed to notice the frightened little animal weaving desperately between skirts and boots, in real danger of being stepped upon by someone's careless heel. Eleanor moved without stopping to think, crouching low to the floor and speaking in the soft, steady voice she might use to calm a nervous horse or a frightened child. The dog hesitated for only a moment before coming to her, trembling all over, and allowed her to gently gather the trailing leash into her hand. "You have a gift for calming frightened things," said a voice from somewhere above her, and Eleanor looked up to find the Duke of Calloway watching her, with an expression she could not immediately name. "He was frightened by the noise, Your Grace," Eleanor said, rising carefully and offering him the leash. Crowds can be quite overwhelming for those unused to them. Something in the quiet way she said this made the Duke tilt his head slightly, studying her more closely. "Are you speaking only of the dog, Miss Whitfield?" "Eleanor Whitfield," she answered, feeling a faint warmth rise to her cheeks at having been so plainly seen and understood. "And yes, Your Grace, I suppose I was speaking of rather more than the dog." The Duke accepted the leash, but his attention remained fixed on her face, rather than on the small animal now sitting calmly at his feet. Most young ladies in this room would have called for a servant, rather than risk their gowns crouching on a ballroom floor. Most young ladies were not standing quite as close to him as I happened to be, Eleanor replied simply. It was not flirtation, and it was certainly not calculation. It was only honesty, offered in the same quiet, unremarkable way Eleanor said most things in her life. Yet the Duke laughed at this, a genuine sound of real amusement that turned several curious heads nearby, and Eleanor realized with some surprise that she had made him laugh without ever intending to do so. "Will you walk with me in the garden, Miss Whitfield?" he asked. "I find I have had quite enough of crowded rooms for one evening." Across the ballroom, Margaret watched in open disbelief as their quiet, overlooked sister, the one neither she nor Constance had ever thought worth worrying about, walked through the garden doors on the arm of the Duke of Calloway, while half the assembled guests turned to watch in astonishment. The garden outside was cool and fragrant, lit softly by lanterns strung between tall hedges, and Eleanor found herself speaking more freely than she had in years. The Duke asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in her answers, not the polite half-attention she had grown accustomed to receiving from men who spoke to her only while waiting for one of her sisters to become available. "You are not at all what I expected from a daughter of Sir Walter Whitfield," the Duke said as they paused beside a quiet stone fountain. "I am rarely what anyone expects," Eleanor admitted honestly. "My sisters are the ones people expect great things from. I am simply there, present, but unremarked upon." "That seems to me a great waste," the Duke said, and something new in his voice made Eleanor look at him more closely than before. "I have spent the better part of this evening being admired only for my title and my fortune, Miss Whitfield. It grows tiresome, being valued for things that have nothing whatsoever to do with who I truly am. You spoke to me as though I were simply a man standing near a frightened dog, nothing more and nothing less. "You were simply a man standing near a frightened dog," Eleanor said, and the Duke laughed warmly once again. They returned to the ballroom nearly an hour later, and by then the entire gathering had taken careful note of the Duke's lengthy absence with the quietest of the three Whitfield sisters. Margaret's bright smile had grown noticeably brittle around the edges. Constance whispered furiously behind her painted fan to anyone who would listen. Lady Whitfield looked as though she might faint from sheer confusion at the unexpected turn the evening had taken. In the weeks that followed, the Duke called upon the Whitfield household with a regularity that could no longer be mistaken for simple politeness. He brought books he thought Eleanor might enjoy, having carefully noted her quiet preference for shaded corners and her sharp, thoughtful observations about the people around her. He asked her opinion on matters of estate management and country life, conversation she found far more engaging than any amount of ballroom gossip, and he listened closely to her answers, as though they carried real and lasting weight. Margaret and Constance, who had spent their entire lives accustomed to being the bright center of every room they entered, found themselves growing increasingly sidelined in their own family home as the Duke's attention settled, unmistakably and permanently, upon their younger sister. Lady Whitfield attempted, on more than one occasion, to gently redirect his visits toward her elder daughters, suggesting that Margaret might play the pianoforte for him, or that Constance might display her newest gown, but the Duke's eyes always returned, again and again, to Eleanor, seated quietly nearby with a book or a piece of needlework, listening far more than she ever spoke. "I simply do not understand it," Margaret said one evening, after the Duke had finally departed following another lengthy visit spent largely in quiet conversation with Eleanor. "What does he see in her that he cannot seem to find in either of us?" It was Constance, rather surprisingly, who offered an answer. "He sees someone who is not performing for him," she said quietly, almost to herself. "We have spent our whole lives carefully learning how to be admired by others. Eleanor never learned anything of the sort. Perhaps that is precisely why he prefers her company to ours." The proposal, when it finally came, arrived on a quiet afternoon in the rose garden behind the Whitfield estate, with no audience present, except for the elderly gardener trimming hedges some distance away. The Duke did not kneel with any dramatic flourish, nor did he deliver some carefully rehearsed speech meant to impress. He simply took Eleanor's hand in his own and told her, plainly and honestly, that he had never in his life met anyone who made him feel so completely and comfortably himself, and that he could not begin to imagine the rest of his years without her quiet honesty beside him. Eleanor, who had spent her entire life expecting to be overlooked by everyone around her, found herself weeping then, not from sorrow, but from the strange and overwhelming relief of finally, truly being seen by another person. The wedding, when it came at last, was attended by nearly every family of consequence in the county, including many who had never once before thought to invite Eleanor Whitfield to any gathering in her own right. Margaret and Constance stood among the wedding attendants, their gowns as lovely as ever, yet it was Eleanor who walked slowly down the long aisle toward the man who had chosen her, not for her beauty or her practiced charm, but for exactly who she truly was beneath all of it. Lady Whitfield, watching her youngest daughter become a duchess before her very eyes, finally understood something she had failed to see clearly for 20 long years: that the daughter she had spent the least time admiring had needed the least correcting all along, simply because she had never once tried to be anyone other than herself. In the years that followed their marriage, Eleanor settled into her new life at Ashbourne Hall, with the same quiet steadiness that had first drawn the Duke's attention. She did not change herself to fit the role of Duchess, nor did she suddenly become loud or showy to match the grandeur of her new surroundings. Instead, she brought her own quiet gifts to the role: a careful eye for the needs of the household staff, a genuine interest in the tenant families on the estate, and a steady, listening presence that made everyone around her feel, perhaps for the first time, truly heard. Margaret eventually married a respectable gentleman from a neighboring county, a match that suited her bright energy well enough, while Constance found happiness with a young officer whose admiration for her beauty never seemed to fade. Both sisters, in time, came to visit Ashbourne Hall often, and both grew to genuinely respect the quiet sister they had once so easily overlooked. And the Duke of Calloway, watching his wife laugh softly at something only she found amusing on a quiet evening in their garden, knew without any doubt that he had chosen correctly. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by people who wanted desperately to be noticed and admired. He had finally found the one person who had never once asked to be noticed at all, and in that quiet, unassuming honesty, he had found exactly what he never knew he was searching for.